Good afternoon, everyone. I want to say thank you for joining us this morning. Today's session that you're going to be taking part in is the GIS for public safety personnel. I think we can all appreciate how important this is, especially after all these days that you guys have been involved with these sessions, both from public safety and GIS perspectives. My name is John Joseph. I am the public safety specialist here at Datamark. And of course, I'm joined today by my colleagues, Sandy Dyer and Jeff Ledbetter. Before we get started, I want to make sure that everybody knows that we are going to be recording today's session. And of course, all of the attendees are muted. So if for some reason you have a question, you want to go ahead and interact with the team here, feel free to go through and go to the bottom of your screen and ask a question. And of course, we're going to try and answer as many of those today as we can before the end of the session. As I said before, I'm joined today by Sandy Dyer. Say hi, Sandy.
Jeff
Ledbetter. And I'm going to hand it over to these guys to go ahead and do all of the talking. So thank you, guys.
Thanks, John.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So actually, in case you didn't see, welcome to GIS Basics for the Public Safety Professional. Jeff and I are going to be your presenters today. So what are we going to talk about? Well, so today's session is really a high-level review of some basic GIS concepts to help you better understand what GIS is and how it works. We've included some public safety examples of GIS functionality in order to help convey the concepts of GIS. And while we will touch briefly on how GIS is used in Next Generation 911, the examples created are intended for what you use in the PSAP today. They will not necessarily be intended for how Next Generation 911 utilizes that information. We're going to touch on it a little bit, but the intent today was not to specifically talk about NG 911. It was really to kind of get you up to speed on how GIS works. So today's session, we're going to talk about what GIS is. We're going to talk about data types and the data quality that apply to those data types. And I hope by the end of the day, you can see the importance to you in public safety. So let's start by taking a poll. Now, this poll is going to help Jeff and I to better understand who our audience is so we can craft our message for you better. So if we can go ahead and get that poll launched. And Jeff, if you can let me know when it's launched. I don't know if I get to see it.
Oh, yeah, I forgot. That's my job. Here you go.
That's your job.
Poll is launched. Oh.
Thank you. So if you could take the next 30 seconds, maybe a minute to just respond.
Sorry, it's not cooperating here. We may have to punt the poll. Let's see. It just says failed to launch. Sorry. No poll.
Hey, John.
Yep. Yeah,
can you try to launch?
I'm going to end the poll and I'm going to try and see if I can relaunch it.
Oh, there we go.
Got it?
It should be out there now, huh? Nothing like some good technical difficulties get started with the hour-long session.
I know.
Huh?
So the poll is
launch the poll at this point.
I'm sorry, what?
I do show that it's been launched at this point. Do you see it there, Jeff?
Okay.
Yep, there it is.
Perfect.
Everybody should see it on the screen now.
So if you can respond to the poll, what level do you operate at? Are you GIS support? Are you a dispatcher? Are you a public safety supervisor or manager? Do you do 911 coordination, whether at a local, county, or state level? And then if you're a third-party vendor.
Looks like we have an overwhelming audience here of GIS folks. About 2/3 of GIS folks, and the rest are kind of either 911 and a few third-party vendors as well. So I would say, as you go through these things, to the 2/3 of you who are GIS nerds like me, is what you should listen for, and especially in Sandy's discussion, is that public safety perspective of GIS, so that you can kind of begin to hear and understand the language that you can speak Because I know for me, it's throughout my career, the challenge has been, how do I take geek speak and turn it into English that others would understand? And so we'll get a lot of that out of Sandy's perspective, and I've learned a few things throughout that time to make it a little bit more approachable as well. So be looking for those things.
And it's also gonna, for the GIS folks, this is not a deep dive into GIS. It's just kind of touching on things that the dispatcher could recognize as potentially being a concern and it being associated with GIS, but it's not there to explain every concept. So, and is not intended to be highly technical as well. So, just to give a little bit background on myself. So I, previous to coming to Datamark, 30 years in public safety dispatcher, 911 county coordinator, and then most recently with a state 911 office, where I deployed wireless phase 2, did GIS projects, did anything that the PSAP needed, any kind of 911 network or equipment facilitation. And the reason that I bring that up is in my previous role with the state 911 office, I would talk to PSAP administrators all the time about the need to teach our dispatchers how GIS works. And as you can imagine, generally there was a lack of interest, with one even telling me they dispatch and they do that well, they don't need to know GIS. And to be honest with you, I always found that confusing. I mean, part of dispatching is using the radio. And we teach you about the radio and how to use it. We teach you how to patch channels or why an area has no coverage and what to do with those no coverage areas, right? And, or we, you know, part of your dispatching is I answer the phone. And so we teach you how to use the phone, which is actually in a 911 center, a highly sophisticated piece of equipment. It's more of a computer than it is really a phone. And we teach how to help callers. So we'll teach them things like, hey, if something goes wrong during the call, like if they don't receive the information on their 911 screen, what do? Well, you teach them how to rebid and to pull that information back through, or the proper way to handle a missing child call. And then as well, part of dispatching is using their CAD, which is computer-aided dispatch. We teach them how to use it. We teach them what fields need to be populated in the call for service screen, why it's important. So I guess when I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about how PSAP administrators would say, well, they dispatch, they do that well, they don't need to know GIS. I guess the reason they didn't find value in teaching dispatchers GIS is because they don't think that's a part of dispatching. And actually, that's kind of further than the truth. I mean, GIS is a part of dispatching. Almost every application that involves location information, any mapping that's utilized in the PSAP, automatic vehicle location, crime analysis, we utilize all these systems in the 911 center. And the reality is they're using GIS every day, and they're not just using it as a map, right? So they do have maps. You have 911 maps, you have CAD maps. That will take the 911 call, it will plot the call, it'll provide more information about the call. There are aerials in it, their CAD systems, their computer-aided dispatch will do the same. So they're using GIS every day, but they don't realize they're using GIS every day. And they don't realize that you have all of these components, all these different GIS data sets that are going into these applications that they use currently, their CAD, their 911 mapping, and their automatic vehicle location. And then as well with next generation 911, when the GIS now becomes a part of the 911 network itself, in next generation 911, we will utilize geospatial call routing. And at the heart of the 911 network, when a 911 call is placed, it will use GIS. Now, the easiest way to describe for your comm center, whether you're a dispatcher or a GIS person trying to explain next generation 911, is that, well, so in today, you have a 911 map and you receive a 911 call and your call will plot against the 911 map. Next Generation 911 is taking that same concept and it's placing it at the time that the 911 call is placed. So when someone dials 911, there's going to be a GIS map sitting at the heart of the network. It's going to validate the caller's location. It's going to plot it on the map, and then it's going to look to the map to figure out, where do I send this 911 call? It's going to send the 911 call to the 911 center, known as a PSAP, a public safety answering point. And then in the PSAP, it's going to plot the call for the dispatcher as well to provide them all that information to help assist them in locating the caller. So when you're trying to describe Next Generation 911 to someone in the PSAP and the value of them understanding GIS, perhaps the concept of, see this map that you're using here to plot your 911 calls. This same map and the functionality of it, to some extent, will be sitting at the beginning of the 911 call. And all the same kind of errors we see at the end of the 911 call, those errors can happen within that map that will support the 911 call. Understanding how GIS works will help you to understand when your community moves to geospatial routing in an NG91 environment, why you're getting that 911 call and why you're running into certain problems. Just gives you a general understanding.
Sandy, just the flip of that is that as a GIS nerd, when I first started talking to 911 professionals, it was kind of frustrating to hear my data management system, my geographic information system, being referred to as the map, because maps are kind of an output, an end product of GIS that don't really get that much of our attention, but it focuses so much around data systems and people that there's kind of the iceberg below the surface that when it gets referred to as a map kind of makes a GIS nerd kind of recoil a bit. What I had to understand was that the very point that you're well made there is that they didn't see this as an important part of their business, because even though they were using its data and its systems and consequently their people, the GIS people, they didn't know that's what they were doing. And so I realized that it was really just a piece of education that needed to occur on the technology that they were using on a daily basis that became the breakthrough point for them and for me. So let's talk a little bit about what is GIS, right? GIS is, as I mentioned, a system full of data and with people that can run it to give you information about location intelligence, if you will. It's geographic and it's information. I'm from Texas, and so I can say it just so, and if you're listening in from any part of the South, you'll understand that this data is what we call spatial. And I don't mean that it's special, but rather that it's about space or a location on the earth. If we can proceed to the next slide. It's about storing and manipulating that data to answer the questions that you need, the where questions. When I get into a situation where people say, well, what do you do for a living? Sometimes it's difficult to explain, and so I've boiled it down to just that way, that GIS helps answer where questions. And when we apply it to the public safety space, what are the where questions? Where is the caller? Where is the emergency? Where is the responder? Where is the route that connects the two most efficiently? And people click on that pretty quick. Most importantly, though, what I want public safety professionals to understand, that GIS is much more than a map. It's people, right? Professionals and secondaries that do work with data and systems in order to provide, yes, a map, but also to provide a powerful informatic tool that can do analytics and help make decisions, right? And support decisions, big and small. And that's exactly how the map gets used in a PSAP, right? Is to help that call taker support the decisions they're making in order to dispatch resources, in order to elevate the level of call and attention that each of these calls for service get. And so the way that GIS people are involved in the system varies widely. This was another important point as I began to understand the public safety landscape, is that it's a very regimented organizationally speaking. It's kind of a paramilitary organization, right? So everybody has very clear definitions of who's the boss, what they provide, and if you don't get it from your line level person, you can move right to the next point on the chain and get what you need. GIS, on the other hand, is much more patchwork in its organization, and it's deployed in different ways. Different organizations with different budgets, different business needs have deployed GIS technology through all the way from, you know, not having any, right? So there's plenty of public safety answering points that don't use a map in their CAD system, but will need to understand some of these concepts as we move forward into Next Gen 911 routing of calls. There's plenty of PSAPs out there that have that one dispatch supervisor who is really good at the Excel spreadsheets for QA. They turned into the GIS person because, well, they were the most technical. And so that's what I would refer to as a GIS secondary position. Others, you know, are supported by perhaps a city or a county GIS organization that's a one-person band, or outsourced to a contractor, and it's expensive because for every hour you use that resource, it costs a hard cost of money. And yet others have lots of GIS resources and get great support for their PSAP because they're supported by an enterprise GIS department. That's one thing that I think should be impressed upon the public safety professional, is that depending on how your organization is supported for its GIS data needs, you may be very frustrated at getting what you need out of a GIS system, or you may be very well supported. So we talk about GIS data, and we'll show you in just a second. We'll demonstrate how data becomes a map and it becomes the thing that's useful for you. But first there's a couple of types of data. Spatial data, which is the coordinate data or the location data, and tabular data or non-spatial data is what we refer to as flat data. Things like Excel spreadsheets and text files would be tabular data. These help create the relationship of the location and the information, the geography and the information. Next slide. Again, spatial is perhaps a term that you don't use all the time. So we want to make sure that you understand that it's relating to or occupying a space or a location on the earth. Next slide. And then just to expand a little bit more on spatial data types, you'll hear GIS nerds talking to you about these: points, lines, polygons, and imagery. Points represent a very precise location, that something like an address point, right? Lines represent linear features, as the name would imply, things like road center lines for public safety professionals. And polygons represent areas. Now, as a GIS nerd, when I take an airplane, I look down below, and this imagery makes me think of it as well. And I don't see farm fields and people and tractors and houses and buildings. Rather, I see points, lines, and polygons because of my training. And so that's how we think as GIS professionals. And it's important to note that almost anything can be represented by almost any of these geometry types. We refer to them as geometry types. A road can be represented by a point as the midpoint of the road or the end point of the road. A road can be represented as a line. A road can be represented as a polygon or like a traveled path. And so these are some of the geometry types that are very basic. And this is the demonstration of how those three geometry types come together. The points, the address points on the right, the road center lines, and the polygons of the parcels come together and turn into a map. So we refer to those as well as layers. So you may hear about layers of data. Those layers come together to form the map. Next slide. It's a little bit like a sandwich, right? Earlier in the week, we had someone from Esri doing a presentation. They referred to it as a little bit like lasagna, similar idea. The layers are good individually, interesting, right? Aerial photos are interesting. Address points give you important data. But when it comes together into the map, the deliciousness lies in the way that the layers work together. You get one bite of all of it together. It's better than one bite of any of the individual layers.
So let me try to translate for public safety folks, tabular and spatial data types. Now, depending on what your role is in public safety or 911, you may be familiar with what's called a master street address guide or an MSAG. You may not. So let me take a few moments to explain it. The master street address guide, which is this graphic information, this graphic, the higher graphic here. Are you able to see my mouse?
Yes.
Okay. So this graphic here is a representation of a master street address guide. Now, a master street address guide is a tabular database. It's basically an Excel spreadsheet with a bunch of information on it. The master street address guide is what informs the 911 system today. It's what tells the 911 system what it can do. So it includes a low and high range, meaning these are address ranges. It includes a street prefix, which is north, south, east, or west, or empty if you don't use them. Street name and street suffix, so main street. Sometimes these are separate fields, sometimes they're single. You have a community name, and then you have what's called an ESN, an emergency service number. Now this emergency service number tells the 911 system, send this to the police department, send this to the sheriff's office, send this to whatever 911 center or public safety answering point it needs to go to. It's a tabular database that sits in our 911 network. In GIS, we have what's called a road centerline layer, and it's kind of the spatial representation of the MSAG, the Master Street Address Guide. So the same elements exist. So while you have low to high here, this also has a low to high, 1300 to 1399. It's South Validation Avenue. It has a community name of Highlands, and it has an ESN as well. So this type of tabular information resides within GIS, but it sits behind the actual geographic feature that you see. So you'll see a line and this information sits there. That information sits there because it's sitting in a database similar to this behind the GIS. Now, there is lots of information that sits in this database. And what they do in the map is they pull forward for you a certain amount of information. So you may see the range, or you may just see the street name, but you don't actually see the range. There's lots of information. If you think you want to see more information, you just need to talk with your GIS professional about pulling that information through. Or if it doesn't exist, they could say, well, I can get that. They just didn't know you wanted it. Now, what's important to realize from a public safety point of view, the address range, this road center line from a 911 perspective, with a physical address, say of 123 North Main Street, the road center line is only used if that address itself can't find an address point first. It's generally how it's set up. Doesn't mean that your map is set up that way, but this is how next generation 911 will be set up. So say I receive a call from 123 North Main Street. If you have address points and it finds a corresponding address point, it will plot there. If it doesn't find a corresponding address point, it's going to plot on your road network instead. The reason that it's important to understand that is if a call plots on your road network, it's not that that address is real. It just means that there was a range that was able to accept that address. So if this call came in as 1345 South Validation Avenue, Highlands, 1345 sits between 1300 and 1399. So it found a spot to go on the range. But it doesn't mean it's a real address. More research would have to be done. So when we talk about data types, in order for the data type to work properly, we have to have data quality that sits behind it. Data quality is a set of rules that describe how that geographic feature, the points, lines, and polygons, are going to interact with each other. And data quality itself can include accuracy, precision, data completeness, and data consistency. So the best way to convey this, we're going to use the data types we talked about, and we're going to apply these data quality rules. I know this is going to sound boring, but bear with me, okay? So the first 2 points of data quality are accuracy and precision. Let's apply to the address points. Well, the point data type, we'll call them address points because that's probably the most commonly known point file. And actually, I'm going to ask Jeff to explain accuracy and precision because he does this much better than I do.
Yeah, great. So accuracy, if you think of it as the graphics demonstrate here, in terms of if you've ever done any kind of shooting sport, firearms, bows and arrows, things like that, you have a bullseye that is the actual location of a thing. When you measure accuracy, you measure the correctness of that location. So as you can see, how close to the bullseye did I get? But when we look at a level of precision, we're looking at how is your grouping. In other words, it's important, but a different measure. It's accuracy to look at whether you hit the bullseye, but when you're looking at precision, you're looking at your answers were close together. We can actually take a really good example of it with this COVID-19 outbreak and all the great mapped resources we've seen, even in terms of like the media reports that we've been seeing as it broke out in China and moved to other countries. We were looking at a level of precision of what countries is it at. Now that it's moved to the US, we looked at what states have outbreaks. And as it comes home closer and closer to all of us, we're looking at what counties or cities have outbreaks. As we go through countries and states and counties and cities, we've moved up in precision, right? So as I bring my hand down, we've moved up in precision. The granularity of the reporting has increased. And that's really what we're looking at in terms of precision. So accuracy is about correctness or closeness to the bullseye. Precision is a measure of variability that really says, do I have a nice tight grouping?
Thank you, Jeff. So we're going to go ahead and launch a poll, and this poll is going to apply to the next slide. Okay, so when you look at this slide here, which one of the following answers most accurately describes the address points in this slide? Are they accurate, precise, or both accurate and precise?
Boy, watching these come in, it's kind of like watching a day at the races. All right, good. We've got some good answers here. Let's go ahead and give everybody another second and we'll share the results of this poll. They're pretty even so far. All right, let's go ahead and end the poll. And we'll share the results so everybody can see them. Accurate wins the day with 40%, but 29% say it's precise and another 30 say both accurate and precise.
So the proper answer is accurate. These address points are accurate, but not necessarily precise. The address points are in the middle of their respective parcel boundary, And assuming that the attribute data, which is the tabular data that sits behind the address point, is correct, then this point is accurate. It's not necessarily precise though.
Well, then let me offer this too as well, Sandy. It's accurate to the level of precision, and I think this is the point you're going to make on this slide. It's accurate to the level of precision. So the level of precision on the last slide was the parcel. It's accurate. But if the level of precision on the last slide is the structure, it's not accurate necessarily.
Correct. Thank you, Jeff. Told you, public safety, GIS. So precision is how precise we are with the placement, depending on what we want the placement to be. So an address point can be placed on a structure. It could be placed at the center of a parcel. It could be placed on a driveway. It doesn't mean that the center of the parcel is less precise, but depending on what the intent was of the appointment of the point placement of the point, the placement of the point, that's not working out well, is really going to determine the level of precision. Now, if this point sitting here is actually for this house here, it's no longer precise or accurate. It's in the wrong place altogether. Now, why is this valuable to public safety folks? So there's a value in knowing how your points are placed. Is it on the structure? Is it in the middle of the parcel? Or is it sitting on the driveway? Because this information in itself can help you and your responding units with decisions that need to be made. So if it's sitting on the driveway, but not sitting on the structure, then really the intent of the point is to say, this is how you enter the property, but not necessarily where the house is. One of the advantages in Next Generation 911 is we have the ability to tell you what kind of point that is. So, the GIS has been expanded to collect that information. So I would encourage our public safety folks that if that information is available, you may want to ask that it be brought through as an available information point in your map so you can help with your response to know, hey, you're just finding the driveway, this is just the center of the parcel, or if this is a structure. Now, you can even get more precise. You can decide that we're going to put points on every structure of the property. You would have to look at your GIS more closely to see whether or not that's what's going on, and then speak with your GIS professionals about the use of this concept within your public safety response. This concept is absolutely valuable when you have a trailer park or suites on buildings, and then that way each point on every one of the suites within a strip mall can indicate, suite 100, 200, 300 versus one point that just represents the entire strip mall as a whole.
I think another important concept about accuracy and precision is that they don't exist independent of one another. There's a relationship between the two. It's not a question of is it accurate or is it precise. It's a question of is it accurate at the right level of precision, and what is the level of precision at which we want to be accurate.
So why are accuracy and precision important to the public safety dispatcher? Well, so say you receive a 911 call and you have a medical going on at the parking lot of an address. And the way the GIS has been developed is that the point itself sits on the driveway entrance. It sits at the main road itself. So we dispatch our fire unit, right? And our fire unit gets to the parking lot and says, ma'am, I can't find the RP, the reporting party or the responsible party. I can't find the patient. Help me out, right? How many times does that happen? Well, the reality is the address itself is actually down here at this business instead. So while placing the point on the roadway to lead them in is helpful, it may have been more helpful if the actual point was placed here instead, which would have led the fire truck to the exact location. Now, this is doable. We can just understand that our points are sitting on the road. It's sitting at the driveway. And when we understand that, then we know we need to look at the map more closely to help lead them in to where the actual structure is. But this can create some complications in responding quickly to an emergency, especially when there are two parking lots involved in the same area. Jeff?
Yeah, so as we start to look at lines, these lines tend to form, especially as a good example in road center lines, tend to form what we call a network. So in a network, lines come together and they should meet at nodes or endpoints or vertexes, to use a geometric term. Whenever we see data quality of those networks and these lines as they come together, we often see overshoots and undershoots. As you can kind of see in the visual examples on the left, the overshoot is one that intersects a line instead of connecting at a node, where an undershoot is one that didn't get to the node and doesn't intersect a line or falls short. I think we have a poll question up about this as well. You want to proceed to the next slide, please? So can you think of, the poll is going to be about, let me go ahead and launch it, sorry. The poll is going to be about, oops, it failed for me again. Can you get it to go, John?
Wow, it's always on a Friday when all these happen, right?
There you go, John's got it. Some reason I don't have to touch. Think about, in light of an overshoot or an undershoot, what could be an example of a legitimate overshoot? A bridge, a roller coaster over the bay, an overpass, train track crossing a street. And then thinking about undershoots as well, what could be a legitimate undershoot? You completely missed the target at the range. I had a hard time saying that one with a straight face, didn't I? An underpass or a subway, maybe a dead end. Got some good answers coming in here. And let me just go ahead and end the polling. We'll share the results. We got some good answers. We got some good winners here.
Nice.
An example of a legitimate overshoot would be an overpass. Yeah, where there isn't an intersection, so you wouldn't want it to break. And then an undershoot, a dead end. You can kind of see it here. The map where they don't connect. GIS nerds often kind of use automated tools to find things within a certain tolerance that look like they perhaps should connect but aren't connected, where this is a good example where you can see with the aerial that there's a good reason that it doesn't connect, because the roads are separated by a wash. Those are two examples of overshoots and undershoots.
And just to clarify for the audience, this is not Texas, this is Arizona where I'm at. Just to make it feel a little bit more familiar.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's take the line example, road center lines, and let's talk about the data quality of undershoots and overshoots and how this may affect you in supporting your emergency response. So we have an emergency going on here at this house. Okay, and here we have an undershoot. We have a fire station here, and we have a fire station here. Which one of these fire stations are going to get recommended for response? Well, based on the undershoot, fire station 2 would respond because there isn't connectivity seen here for fire station 1. The only way fire station 1 would be able to respond is if they went completely past fire station 2 to get to this residence, based on the undershoot. However, if we fix the undershoot, then fire station 1 can get directly there. Now, it's a basic concept of undershoots. And it could be that even in this example here, it's not an undershoot because it's intended to end here, and that's where more research would be needed. But this is in one way that you can see where it could affect closest unit routing. So if your CAD system is saying, hey, fire station 1 is closest unit based on this, or my patrol unit is closest unit based on their your AVL, your automatic vehicle location solutions, it could be that even with routing within the system, because of the line work, that it's not making the recommendations it should. So if you find that you have areas and subdivisions or something like that, that fires that your responders aren't getting there where they need to be, it could end up to be a GIS problem, and maybe you should reach out to your GIS professionals and say, hey, can you help us take a look at it? Sometimes it's not the tabular data that's associated. As well with overshoots, in this scenario, while we can dispatch our unit, because it's an overshoot, it may not find the structure as well. It actually could take it to the end of the road here. It's going to pass this house completely because there isn't anything, there isn't this vertices, if you will, if I'm going to do this right, Jeff, to tell the fire truck, hey, you can actually turn here. It's going to look at it like it's an overpass. And then they're going to get to this area and say, ma'am, I don't even know which house it is. Say it's the middle of the night. They don't have good lighting. They don't post their house numbers. Shocker, right? They could drive completely back past where the emergency is without knowing it. And that could happen because of an overshoot. It's a basic example. And for the GIS folks that are on the call, I realize that there are other technical parameters around that, but trying to convey the difference between undershoots and overshoots and how they can impact emergency response. So Jeff, are we holding questions to the end, or do you want to handle them?
I think I want to hold the two that are out there to the end. We'll get through these because I think we've got some good information coming that'll help see this as well.
Okay.
So let's continue our discussion of data quality and in regards to polygons. The big no-nos here are gaps, overlaps, and duplicates. Back in old ARC info, we would call them cracks and slivers, where a gap, look what I did. A gap was a crack and an overlap was a sliver. You can imagine the idea, right? Where two areas come together, but they think they're connecting, but they're not. That is a gap. And where two polygons overlap and have an area of coincidence is a problem as well. If you move to the next slide, please. In NextGen 901, for an example, this is an important data quality metric. PSAP boundaries, emergency service boundaries, and provisioning boundaries are polygons, and none of them can have gaps, overlaps, or duplicate polygons because the software elements that will be interpreting the data are going to do a point in polygon query, and it's going to take the first answer. So duplicates don't help. If there's a gap, the answer is I don't have an answer, and if there's an overlap, again, it's just the same as if there were a duplicate in that particular location. So those are required elements that have to meet a data quality standard that doesn't allow for these confusing answers for the software elements. So how would this particular scenario affect NG901 call routing? Again, noting that in in-state NextGen 901 call routing system, these are machine-to-machine interfaces that will interpret GIS data without the benefit of the thinking brain of a person to make decisions. The advantage of this setup is that it happens in milliseconds or whatever, nanoseconds, however it gets measured, but super fast. The problem will come in to play when your GIS data quality in polygons leaves this gap. So it's a similar idea, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, Sandy, but the same idea as a default route today. If the MSAG and ALI don't know where to send it, it's going to send it to a default place. That's going to occur with policy routing roles in a NextGen 901 call routing system as well. And when a coordinate lands in the middle of a gap, it'll hit that sort of default routing rule, and it won't be able to answer the question properly. So this is a big GIS data quality problem for a next-gen 911 call routing system.
Now there are within the next generation core services, which is where geospatial routing is going to reside. Your next generation core service provider can put rules in place to help some gaps and overlaps. Gaps, it can decide within a certain threshold, I'm going to snap the gap this way or snap the gap that way. And you can rely on those rules to help clean up gaps. In next generation 911 planning that I've been a part of, we didn't want a machine to decide which way this went. Because even if the tolerance said, oh, this is the most reasonable boundary, how do we really know that for sure? I would rather our GIS professionals research it, fix the gap on their own, than to allow a rule within the machine to be able to make these decisions.
Right.
And why is that? A life's going to depend on it. And when 911 is utilizing GIS, that means the GIS then has to save a life as well. So some decisions that we've historically have used rules within softwares and other resources to be able to solve, we need to have more people attention to it, which is why people in GIS are so important, and public safety dispatchers reporting errors to GIS people to get them solved are going to be important. Like Jeff pointed out today, when we use our GIS, it's after we receive the 911 call, and we'll look at our map and we'll say, I don't think that's right. I think the map's wrong. And the dispatcher has the ability to change their mind about what they're going to do, right? Or change the map's mind about how we're going to handle this 911 call. That person, like Jeff said, isn't existing when in the next generation 911 network. There's no human sitting at the time the call is placed to say, don't do what the GIS says, do something different. We could do it. We could solve that a little bit with rules, and that's not the intent of today's conversation. But it's going to be important that the same people be involved, and they're involved at the development and the maintenance of the GIS data, so we don't run into these problems, right? I'm sorry, Jeff. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, and that's what you're demonstrating there really shows that people are important to this process and this collection. That it's important to define GIS as data systems and people, because not only, which is similar in a PSAP, right, or a 911 setting, the people are important for getting the answer out the door. In this case, in the next gen 911 scenario, the people are important, GIS people are important up front to make sure that these things get sewn up. I think we can move to the next slide. Then when we look at data completeness and consistency, it's really important that in a life-dependent situation, like next-gen 911 call routing, that your data is as complete as possible. Now, there's addresses, road center lines. These are things that change on a regular basis and can be very dynamic data sets. And so maybe it's not always complete and always consistent, but it needs to be substantially complete and as substantially complete as possible. The data has to be consistent between systems as well. As you pointed out just now, the GIS data that's going to be used in the next gen 911 call routing system in those machine-to-machine interfaces should be consistent with the data that's going to be used on the flip side of the call delivery in the CAD system to help the dispatcher make those determinations of how to affect the response as well. I think Sandy's got a great example of how this becomes really relevant.
So why is data completeness and consistency important to public safety in 911? Well, let's use our earlier example, right? So we have an emergency happening in the parking lot, and our fire unit is dispatched to the address point that's listed on the driveway. And that's not a problem. Even though our emergency is happening here, We know that the point sitting on the driveway, we can direct our units in, right? Not a problem. We can handle this from an emergency response point of view. Our dispatcher is going to look at the map and they're going to go, oh, it's really here. I'm going to guide them in. The problem we run into in next generation 911 is what happens when the actual location, the address point that on the structure sits within a different response boundary. In next generation 911, the 911 call coming from this structure is actually going to route to a different PSAP, not PSAP A, where the point on the road is, and end up could being a completely different response altogether. So from a data completeness and data consistency point of view, it's not just how complete is my lines, how complete are my address points, how complete are my polygons. It's also the consistency. In next generation 911, the point, the line, and the polygon all have to answer the same question. Where is my emergency and where do I send that 911 call? So whether we place the point on the road or we place the point on the structure, the point has to answer the same thing. The road, if we don't have address points, has to answer the same thing, and they have to be representative of our polygons. So we can't just look at our address points and say, okay, they're complete and they're consistent and I did everything well. My lines, my polygons. We do that and then we have to put them all together and say, when I put all these together, are they saying the same thing? That's the type of consistency that we need. So folks, that's basically our presentation for today. We do have some questions that we're going to respond to. I hope that we were able to explain to our public safety folks on a very high level what GIS is, how you use it in your communications center today, the value of GIS in what you do, and the fact that GIS is a part of dispatching, whether you realize it or not. And that you now recognize some data quality issues that could be happening. And just like any other problem you may experience in your 911 center, it's going to be important that you report these GIS problems as well. Because especially in a next generation 911 environment, your reporting of that, just like when you today print off your alley screen and hand it to someone and say, hey, this address didn't work, it's going to be important that you do that in NG 911 as well, because optimally, the GIS you're using in the comm center should be the GIS that's helping fueling your 911 system as well.
Great, let's get to some of these questions. First, let's respond to Catherine's question. She says, how can GIS people get discrepancy reports from their E911?
So there's different ways that discrepancy reports, you mean, are we talking about GIS or problems in 911?
Yeah, so I think that's an important distinction we need to make sure is clear, is that GIS data doesn't play a role in E911 routing, and any discrepancy reporting that occurs there is really to support IMSAG and alley maintenance, which doesn't occur necessarily with GIS, but there may be a relationship to play. And any GIS discrepancy reports that come out of an E911 system would be sent to the GIS person by the IMSAG or alley coordinators.
But you know, Catherine, what your question is telling me is that that feedback loop hasn't been created yet. They probably don't know that you're out there and that you should be participating in that. Because whether it's even if it's an E911 problem, if they're using a GIS map currently to plot their 911 calls, they should be looking at 911 addressing, we'll call it that for now, and comparing it to the map and making sure the map can find it. So and if the map isn't finding it.
She did give some clarification. She says really she's talking about CAD issues.
Right.
So how does that, and I think your point is well made, that what that demonstrates is that that feedback loop probably doesn't exist to the level of tightness that it should. Because it's going to come from anywhere from a dispatcher. I think we had this example in a couple of our sessions, a dispatcher writing down something on a sticky note and handing it to the GIS person. I think in a lot of scenarios that occurs to a dispatch supervisor perhaps, and they coalesce them. But our recommendation would be that you set up a business process that allows for solid communication to the GIS person and then back from the GIS person to those pointing out the errors.
Yeah, and sometimes that takes a little bit convincing. I know that sounds silly, but I used to tell my GIS people all the time, I said, you need to have a relationship with your public safety folks. You need to let them know that you're here. So they say, okay, well, they went and sat in the dispatch center. Okay, but I never hear from them. They never tell me that what they want. And I'm like, well, they don't know what they want. They're dispatchers. They don't do what you do. Go explain what you do. Sit a little bit longer, listen to what the concerns are, and explain to them how you can fix that with more GIS or by changing the way the map looks or whatever. Once you build that relationship, they're going to learn to depend on you that much more. But it's really a matter of building. And I'm not saying that Catherine hasn't done this, but I know that a lot of times that relationship hasn't yet been built.
Yeah, it's a work in progress, right?
It is,
Yeah.
Which is a challenge to NG 911 in trying to bring these two industries together.
Yeah, she clarifies this and says the same things basically that you're indicating. So sometimes they complain among themselves, but they don't communicate it back to me to fix, and that she's working on that. So good tips. And it's all about the relationships and making sure that they know what you can offer them, and then for them to kind of absorb and appreciate what that really means. Diane says that our dispatchers email me a picture of the issue and I send to our GIS what is needed. So that's a pretty typical setup as well, as you capture the information from a dispatcher and coalesce it at some supervisor or management level and send it on.
Right. And folks realize dispatchers, the reason they do what they do is because they want to help. That closing that feedback loop by letting them know, I got it, this is what we found, this is what we did to change it, or actually officially that's correct, there wasn't a change that could be made, and educating them is going to be valuable to them continuing to report. They just want to know that that they were able to help another situation. They're really, really fantastic people in that aspect.
Yeah, so Diane pointed out back when we were talking about precision and accuracy, she said we had the issue with a point that was in the center of a parcel instead of on the clubhouse, and it routed EMS down a court road closer than the entrance to the clubhouse, adding 2 minutes to the time. She said we end up having GIS people move address points to the clubhouse, also put in a driveway. And that's a really good way to mitigate some of those circumstances in a CAD system, is to use your commonplace name file to make sure that you know that clubhouse is there, add a point on it, and then create a driveway. I know in rural settings a lot, you have long driveways that a structure may actually be closer to a road that's inaccessible to it than the road that it's addressed off of. And driveways are a great visual way to indicate to the dispatcher that there is something different in this case. She also says another situation, we had an issue point was far from the road that was addressed from, I think it's the same thing I just described, isn't it? Addressed from the fire station was closer to a dead end road. And so the AVL drift would put them to the closer road. So it would add 3 minutes to the routing time. And again, we had to have the GIS add in a driveway so the CAD system could figure out the closest unit.
Right. Man, Diane, I love you. Thank you for providing like real life examples to my my little crappy graphics. That's fantastic. And then it looks like there's a question on, will the MSAG still be used in NG91 since the NEAD will not be coming soon? And for those that don't know what a NEAD is, it was the National Emergency Address Database that was going to help provide some physical addressing, if you will, to wireless calls through mechanisms. The MSAG will still be in place during the transition to an end state of next generation 911. So as long as there are legacy components involved, legacy PSAPs or legacy 911 connectivity, the MSAG may still need to be used in some aspect. Now there are solutions for that. That can be GIS based. So part of the conflicts between the MSAG staying active and GIS being used in transitional states is making sure that those are reconciled and that they're both doing the same thing. But there are ways to solve it to where you're not having to run both databases. And we have actually gone over, so.
Yes, we have, but that's okay. I think we got a lot of great questions, which is really important. I'm glad we were able to get all those. And I want to thank everybody that participated in today's event. Of course, there will be a recording of this that will be saved and be available next week. Thank you, Jeff and Sandy. You guys are awesome. And everybody have a great day and stay safe.